These 8 kings carved real-life horror stories into stone. Let me explain. I'm gonna spare you my narration and give it all to these guys. 252 years of first-person words, one by one in the order they reigned. I'm just gonna connect the dots a little bit. Oh yeah, it's the Neo Assyrian Empire. Buckle up. Meet Ashur-nasirpal II. Now, this guy became a Mesopotamian king in 883 BC. Bro, that's 2,900 years ago. Now, you think he was probably living at like the dawn of organized human life, but it was actually far from it. By the time he was crowned, writing was already 2,500 years old. The Epic of Gilgamesh was already ancient literature, and Mesopotamia had detailed written law for over 1,000 years. These were not people too primitive to know that children were young or that suffering was real. They had astronomy, mathematics, libraries, and elaborate family law. Now, what wasn't invented yet in this world, which would not exist for another 2.5 millennia, was the moral idea that enemy and enemy civilians are a protected category, that collective punishment is forbidden, and just the concept of a war crime. In the world of Ashur-nasirpal, there was only one extremely ancient and coherent principle. The king was the earthly agent of the god Ashur. Where he ruled there was order, where he didn't there was chaos. Therefore, any action or exertion is presented as control itself, order being violently restored to a universe that had slipped. Now, he inherited a kingdom from his father Tukulti-Ninurta II. It was a kingdom that was already sharpened into a weapon, and within his first ascension year, he faced a recurring Neo-Syrian problem: rebellion on the frontier. Now guys, Ashur-nasirpal II styled himself as follows: Ashur-nasir-apli, reliable prince, adorer of the mighty gods, potent dragon, the king of kings, the exalted priest, the destructive weapon of the great gods. Now his first campaign drove down the middle Euphrates to Suru, in the land of Bitalup, an Aramean polity in the Khabur-Euphrates confluence, a zone whose territory would later become eastern Syria and overlap the northern Mesopotamian frontier. Now at Suru, he wanted to prove a point. Remember, to him, these people were rebelling against a cosmic order, and so he had to respond by stripping the rebels of their very identity and turning their bodies into a public text. He flayed all the city's nobles and draped their skins over the heaped corpses. The ringleader he reserved for the empire's most visible wall. I flayed Ahiababa, and I draped his skin over the wall in the city of Nineveh, converting a man into signage hung on the capital for every traveler to read. Then the campaign turned north, to the fortified towns and mountain corridors of the northwestern Mesopotamian and southeastern Anatolian frontier. Think a colder, higher, and way more broken world than any of the river plains overlapping the Armenian highlands or the Kurdish highlands. There was a region there that the Assyrians called Nairi, associated with the Tigris and Euphrates, and the basins of Lake Van and Urmia, later becoming the heartland of Urartu. At Kinabu, the fortified city of Hulayu, listen to what Ashur-nasirpal II did. I fell 600 of their men-at-arms with the sword, and burnt 3,000 captives from them. I did not leave one of them alive as hostage. I captured Hulayu and their city ruler alive. I made a pile of their corpses. I burned their adolescent boys and girls as Muklutu sacrifice. I flayed Hulayu, their city ruler, and draped his skin over the wall of the city of Damdamusa. At Tella, the city of the Nirbu people, whose inhabitants trusted in their strong walls and numerous troops, refused to come down and submit to Ashur-nasirpal II, his inscription after the fact of the response slows down with the longest catalog of mutilation in his historical records. I felled 3,000 of their fighting men with the sword. From some I cut off their arms and hands. From others I cut off their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I hung their heads on trees around the city. I burnt their adolescent boys and girls. I razed, destroyed, burnt, and consumed the city. We also get a sneak peek at the raw conditions he and his troops were fighting through. When we look at the inscription at Bitura of the fortified city of Didiru, we see he crossed the Tigris on rafts of inflated skins, marched his men through the dark, and reached a citadel that his scribes described as sitting at a mountain peak. On the second day before sunrise, I thundered against them, like the god Adad of the devastation, and rained down the flames upon them. I fell 800 of their combat troops with the sword, and cut off their heads. I captured many soldiers alive. The rest of them I burnt. I made a pile of living and of heads before the gate. I impaled on stakes 700 soldiers before their gate. When the survivors fled to the crags of Mount Mutnu, a peak which his scribes called like the point of an iron dagger which no bird reaches, he hunted them into the rock. I slew 1,000 of his warriors in the mountains. I filled the mountain ravines with their carcasses. I captured 200 soldiers alive and I cut off their hands. I dyed the mountain red with their blood and filled the mountain gorges with their corpses. And when the Kashiari range itself, the Turabdin highlands of what's now southeastern Turkey, physically blocked his chariots, he and his soldiers just got to work. For 6 days within Mount Kashiari, a high mountain and rugged terrain which was not suitable for my chariots and troops, I cut through the mountains with iron axes, and I broke open a way with copper hatchets, and got the chariots and troops through. Guys, think about that. He was digging away for 6 days in the alpine cold. And when he finally got to the Nairi lands, I massacred them. I carried off captives from them. I demolished and turned into ruin hills 250 strong-walled cities of the Nairi lands. I lashed out without restraint, the numinous terror of my kingship over the Nairi lands. But then he set the other precedent that the kings of the next 2 centuries would follow. The same man who did it so often that it got put into stone that he was draping skin over walls, now wanted that same attention for his building. He found the old city of Kalhu, modern Nimrud, and razed it again in his own way. It was fallen in ruins and deserted, turned into ruin heaps and wasteland. Exiles which I personally conquered from the countries I now rule. I took all of them and resettled them therein. I dug out a canal from the upper Zab and called it Bati Hegali. I laid out gardens on its banks. I cleared away the rubble of that ruined hill and deepened its foundations to the water level. I sank the foundation stone 120 layers deep. He flanked his northwest palace gates with winged guardians that became the signature symbol of Assyrian power. I made guardian beasts of white limestone and alabaster and set them up at the doors. Thrones of ebony, ivory beds inlaid with silver and gold, dishes and vessels of bronze and iron, all roofed in with looted fragrant timber and furnished with the plundered thrones of the dead. But remember, he wanted to be known. And so when he inaugurated his city, on his own dime, he held a 10-day straight banquet. 69,574 guests in the 9th century BC, consuming 1,000 fattened oxen, 14,000 sheep. I recommend checking out Table of Gods videos on this. Many of the guests, the very tribal leaders that he recently terrorized, seated and fed inside of walls with freshly carved images of him flaying people. Historians refer to Ashur-nasirpal II as the one who set the standard for the warrior kings of Neo Assyria. That 3-tiered calculated theater model that he then left to his son Shalmaneser III. Now reigning from 858 to 824 BC, Shalmaneser III inherited Ashur-nasirpal II's war machine and pointed it west into Syria and the Levant, becoming the first Assyrian king whose record directly collides with the Hebrew Bible, using the captured city of Dilbarship on the Euphrates River as a forward base to drive repeatedly into the Syrian plains, and the Orontes Valley of what is now western Syria. In 853 BC on the Orontes at Karkar, he met a coalition assembled specifically to stop him. 12 kings of the Levantine and the Arabian world, Adad-Ezer of Damascus, Irhuleni of Hamath, the Arab chieftain Gindibu with 1,000 camels, which became the earliest recorded appearance of Arabs in the historical record, and Ahab, king of Israel, who by the Kirk monolith's own reckoning yielded 2,000 chariots and 10,000 foot soldiers. Now the monolith records Shalmaneser III's carnage. I slew 14,000 of their warriors with the sword. Now it's 14,000 dead in a single afternoon by his own count, but he didn't advance further south one step that year, and had to return to fight for the same region again. So the coalition probably fought him to a standstill, probably a draw that was reported as a slaughter, becoming a very early case of propaganda. Now, there's a scene on the monolith with a man prostrating in front of him. Shalmaneser III recording it in 841 BC, I received tribute from Lawa, son of Omri, silver, gold, a golden bowl, A golden tureen, swipe for part 2. It's the 8 kings who carved horror stories into stone, and we're on the second one, Shalmaneser III. Pin the staffs of the king's hands, and a spear. With the kneeling figure being Jehu, Jehu of the Book of Kings, the oldest surviving depiction of any identifiable Israelite, and of any named figure from the Hebrew Bible, in the entire archaeological record. The Assyrians knew Israel as the House of Omri, Bit Humri after its founding dynasty, so they referred to Jehu as son of Omri, even though the Bible itself reports that he came to the throne by a coup. He was no descendant of Omri at all, but the knowledge of him only reaches us through the monument of his humiliation, which should further tell you about Shalmaneser III. Now, the details of the tribute given to him, possibly due to his own reputation along with his father's, was insane. He was the first of the Neo Assyrians on record to have specifically requested for conquered people's daughters, not as diplomatic ties, but listing them in his inscriptions as Madatu, tribute, rather than Rikishtu, mutual diplomatic marriage, openly branding these noble women as subordinate, even to the level of public government records. The daughters of Sangara of Karkemish, Hayanu of Samal, and the king of Hatina, alongside 100 daughters of Sangara's nobles, and at least 104 total women, are explicitly labeled as daughter tribute in the royal records. If we look across the tribute categories of Shalmaneser's 31 military campaigns, about 90% of the entries focus on traditional economic materials: gold, silver, tin, bronze, horses, and cedarwood. About 10% of that are specifically recorded human tribute, a 100% mathematical increase over his predecessor, whose records list 0 instances of demanding royal daughters as formal madatu. Shor and Asirpal prioritized metal and cattle instead. I guess Shalmaneser III was the first playboy Neo-Assyrian, but he extended the Neo-Assyrian Empire's reach to the Mediterranean coast and initiated sustained contact with the Levantine world, Damascus, Israel, Hamath, the Phoenician cities of what's now Lebanon. He was the one who set in motion the long Assyrian involvement with the kingdoms of the Bible that the later kings I'll mention will carry it to its conclusion. He spent his last years at Kalhu, adding a palace and rebuilding the great ziggurat, embellishing the capital his father had founded rather than building his own. However, his own son Shamshi-Adad V had to fight a rival claimant for the throne, the first appearance in this specific chain of internal fracture. The man who carved Israel into stone also at his death handed his heir a throne that he'd have to fight other Assyrians to keep. And because of this, there's a bit of a slump. Up until 744 to 727 BC, when Tiglath-Pileser III took the throne. Now remember, this was a mid-century slump, and he seized the throne in a revolt at Galhu, and in 745 BC rebuilt the empire into a centralized machine, truly professionalizing the army and fully reorganizing the conquered world. He refers to himself, Great King, Mighty King, King of the Universe, King of Assyria. And through this type of demographic engineering, and that Assyrian pride that clearly reflects Ashur and Assirpal, through his campaigns we get a new production of kind of that old vocabulary. He besieged the Aramean city of Arpad for 3 grinding years in northern Syria. The chronicles mark the siege from 741 to 740 BC, and the fall at 739, 3 years of an encircled population starving, while siege ramps crept towards the walls under the Syrian sun. When he broke the Chaldean community of Bit Amukani in the southern Iraqi marshes, we have his inscription of the rebel leader's fate, along with the kingdom. Nabu Shabshi, their king, I hung up in front of the gate of his city on a stake. His land, his wife, his sons, his daughters, his property, the treasure of his palace I carried off. Bit Amukani I trampled down like a threshing sledge. All of its people and its goods I took to Assyria. Guys, a threshing sledge is referring to agriculture, like when you're husking grain, showing you the mechanical mindset of Tiglath-Pileser III, used as a formula even when applied to destroying kingdoms. Now it's his western campaigns, 734 to 732 BC, that not only directly enter the biblical records, but also have him tapping in with every single climate and region, from the Mediterranean coast to the desert's edge. He took Damascus in modern Syria, put its king Rezin to death, and dissolved the ancient kingdom of Aram into a mere Assyrian province. He renamed Bit Hazael. He overran Galilee and Gilead, northern Israel, the Golan, and the highlands east of the Jordan, and deported their populations. An event the Book of Kings record from the other side. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and captured Gilead and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried the people captive to Assyria. Guys, that's 2 Kings 15:29. Now he drove to Gaza on the edge of the Sinai desert, and he pushed northward into the mountains of Urartu, reaching the shores of Lake Van of what is now eastern Turkey and Armenia, then going eastward through the snow passes of the Zagros Mountains into the lands of the Medes of the Iranian plateau, forcing them into submission. With one inscription of an Urartian city, "I slaughtered its warriors, cut off their heads and built a tower with them at its gate." But see, what made Tiglath-Pileser III special was that he was kind of the bureaucratic guy who still had that nuttiness in him. And the way that that manifested itself is through his policy of two-way mass deportation, conducted on a scale never attempted. When he dealt with rebellious populations, he removed it and resettled a different conquered population in its place, but deliberately mixing specific ethnic peoples for the purpose of shattering the very concept of a homeland, so that rebel groups couldn't even find rooted cohesion or retained memory to even sustain a rebellion. He turned ethnic engineering into an instrument of the state, backed by armies and administration, a deliberate scattering of nations to destroy their identity. With the empire growing stronger off this human tide, feeding both its labor force and its army with the uprooted. And in 729 BC, he did something that no Neo-Assyrian king ever dared to do before him. The man took the throne of Babylon itself. Babylon was the most sacred city in Mesopotamia, and even earlier Assyrian kings had to treat it with a wary reverence. Tiglath-Pileser simply claimed its crown, ritually taking the hand of the god Bel, Marduk, to legitimize his rule, and assuming the Babylonian throne name Pulu. According to the Babylonian Chronicle, when Tiglath-Pileser had come down to Akkad, he ravaged Bit Amukani and defeated Nabumukinzeri. Tiglath-Pileser ascended the throne in Babylon. He was now king of Sumer and Akkad, as well as king of Assyria. The two ancient crowns of Mesopotamia joined on one head for the first time, but that union became a curse that he passed down. The proud and holy Babylon and the military religiously prideful Assyria became an extreme balancing act, and we'll see how that went later on. Tiglath-Pileser died in 727 BC, at the absolute height of his power, leaving an empire that was firmly in his son Shalmaneser V's hands, along with the poisoned inheritance. Bringing us to the fourth king, Shalmaneser V, reigning from 727 to 722 BC. He was born Ululayu, son of Tiglath-Pileser III, like we said, taking the title King of Assyria and Babylon. Now, he accomplished one of the most consequential military actions ever, one whose aftermath is still being debated by scholars 3 millennia later. He besieged and destroyed Samaria, the capital of the kingdom of Israel, and ended a nation. But something is weird with his inscriptions, because for an event so consequential in the 252-year chain, and even with his predecessors, Shalmaneser V's first-person words strangely go silent. The Babylonian Chronicle just gives him one phrase: he ravaged Samaria. Our fullest account actually comes from the Hebrew Bible. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria, and placed them in Halah, and on the harbor, the river of Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. That's 2 Kings 17:6. Guys, that figure who you see on the right is actually another figure who we're going to talk about in a second, Sargon II. Now, why am I mentioning him right now? Well, it's likely that he took the credit for Shalmaneser's success. The deportation figure forever attached to the fall of Samaria, 27,290, appears nowhere on Shalmaneser V's inscriptions, but in the records of Sargon, who claimed the conquered city as his founding triumph, even though Shalmaneser V was the one who besieged it for 3 years. Now, after the 3-year grueling siege, the walls finally broke in 722 BC, the system that Tiglath-Pileser invented was now applied to Samaria. The people were dragged from Samaria, scattered to Halah, to Gozan on the Khabur River, what's now northeastern Syria, to the cities of Medes on the Iranian plateau in neck irons, their identities dissolved, becoming the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Time for part 3. These kings carved real-life horror stories into stone. This is part 3. Welcome back. Now, just like we said, the actions of Shalmaneser V between 724 and 722 BC literally caused the 10 lost tribes of Israel to be, well, lost. The theories, the legends, the claims from the Ethiopian communities, to even Japanese and American communities, it's all from Shalmaneser V. But remember what I said? This guy, Sargon II, took credit for it. Now, Sargon II reigns from 722 to 705 BC. Now, I'm pretty sure the true pronunciation of the name Sargon is Sharukin, which means the king is legitimate, and he took that as his throne name, while taking the credit for the fall of Samaria. Seems like the name a man would choose if he really doesn't have a legitimate claim, and he's just trying to engineer it from scratch. This puts Sargon II at a really interesting position. See, remember how Tiglath-Pileser kind of had that Ashur-Nisirpal insanity? But it was through the flowing of his bureaucratic necessity? Well, based on the inferencing that we can do here, this kind of puts Sargon II as the most self-conscious Neo-Assyrian king, especially strategically and in the literary sense. The Neo-Assyrian king's power was rested just as much on spirituality as it was in their force, these things coming together to represent true human influence that is fully codified and verified by some external universal cosmic order, which is internalized within the king and his every single action. Remember, all through Ashur. And so Sargon II had to prove this logic for 17 years across a wider geographic range than any predecessor. From the Palestinian coast to the Armenian highlands, from the marshes of the Persian Gulf to the high plateaus of Anatolia. Of course, he starts his records by claiming Shalmaneser V's prize, recording Samaria's fall and deportation as his own from the very start. He was able to conscript Samaria's surviving fighting men, 50 chariots worth of soldiers, that he could psychologically break and still resettle into his own army, with the Samaritans still being a community living on the same hill near the Nablus. Now, just like all his predecessors, he started to experience rebellion. It was rising from the west. In 720 BC under Ilubidi, the upstart king of Hamath in modern-day western Syria, Sargon recorded the aftermath punishment in pretty visceral detail. I eradicated the land of Hamath and dyed the skin of the rebel Ilubidi red as red wool. Ilubidi was flayed alive, his skin stripped from his own body and soaked in his own blood until it was the color of dyed wool, specifying that the color showed the skin was still wet, and when someone looked at it, it could be compared to dye. He then drove south from Hamath to the coast of the Sinai border, shattering an Egyptian-backed force at Rafia, modern-day Rafah, and recorded the enemy commander fleeing. Anunu, king of Gaza, with Re'e, the field marshal of Egypt, rose up to wage war against me in Rafia, taking fright at the clangor of my weapons, and ran. His whereabouts have never been discovered. At the end of 720 BC, every rebel from the Euphrates to the Sinai was either dead, deported, enslaved, or on their knees. Then came Carchemish in 717 BC, a wealthy Neo-Hittite city sitting directly on the modern Turkish-Syrian border. Sargon records the dismantling of an ancient city, whose king Pisiris had conspired with Midas of Phrygia. Listen to the inventory of Sargon's hall. I carried off as booty gold and silver, the property of his palace, and the guilty people of the city Carchemish, 50 chariots, 200 cavalry horses, and 3,000 of its foot soldiers I added to my royal contingent. I settled the people of Assyria in Carchemish. I had its wall built and raised higher than before. Look, y'all remember Ashur-Nisirpal, right? And you also remember how Sargon isn't really legitimate? Well, look at the formula done here. Full conquest, all done through Ashur. Now with this formalized bureaucratic war machine element to it, with someone at the helm whose creativity in explaining the atrocity isn't as good as his predecessors. Red wool is red wool. But he was going all out. In this case, he conquered and re-engineered the city and specified that he built the wall higher. He's basically telling them, give me that. Stole that shit. That's what I do. He's literally telling them that he can just take what they have, them being all of the ancient peoples around him, and he'll simply use it and maintain it even better than they ever could. All under the guise of Ashur, with him being the legitimate king. Then in 714 BC, he goes against the kingdom of Urartu, Now, this was a mountain kingdom, and it kind of gives us a glimpse on a raw physical view of what Sargon really had to go through. Urartu's heartland was in the Armenian highlands, centered on Lake Van in what is now eastern Turkey, and extending into northwestern Iran. It's a high-altitude world of soaring mountains, deep valleys, roaring snowmelt rivers, and really fierce winters. It's as unlike the Mesopotamian floodplain as any territory the Assyrians had ever invaded. We only really have one line explaining what Sargon thought of all this. He just talked about the campaign being done with great difficulty. The dude was fording rivers swollen with snowmelt, and cutting paths where literally none existed. Tens of thousands of men in bronze and iron armor, horses, mules, chariots, supply weapons, climbing through alpine terrain at altitudes that steal your breath, along with crossing torments cold enough to stop your heart, sleeping on unexposed mountainsides. If you didn't have a sophisticated experience-based knowledge on the human body and climate, sleeping there could get you killed. No Assyrian army before him had penetrated this deep into Urartu's mountain core. He then seized Musasir, Urartu's holiest city, likely near the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, home to the temple of the god Haldi. It was the spiritual center of the Urartian nation. And guess what he did? I counted as booty his wife, his sons, his daughters, his property and his possessions, and the people of the city Musasir. And I carried off the god Haldi with my own hands. Within the Neo-Assyrian framework that Sargon was operating within, this act of extreme sacrilege became nationalistic and personal religious triumph, showing that Ashur was stronger than Haldi, basically saying that the Assyrian king's cosmic order was real, and the Urartian king's wasn't. The Urartian king Rusa I heard about this, and Sargon II recorded his aftermath. Rusa was afraid, and brought his life to an end with his own weapon. I made their king Rusa use flint knives, razors, and daggers on himself. Urartu's god was gone, their king self-mutilated, and its power broke for generations by Assyria. Sargon then marched south, in the marshes in what's now the extreme south of Iraq. Near the head of the Persian Gulf, Sargon destroyed the Chaldean rebel, named Merodach Baladan. I eradicated the city of Dur Yakin, the great city upon which he relied. I heaped up the corpses of his fighting men in piles. Then in 709 BC, he entered Babylon, performing the New Year Akitu festival and taking the hand of the god Bel, with Marduk watching over him, formally becoming the king of Babylon. With that chronic need for legitimacy showing through his restoring of divine statues and patronizing Babylonian temples. Now Sargon was kind of feeling like the man. And to really consolidate his legitimacy, he knew he had to do something major, so he chose to build a capital, choosing a site on the open plain 15 kilometers northeast of Nineveh, in what is now the village of Khorsabad near Mosul in northern Iraq, building a city called Dur Sharukin, or Fort Sargon. Here's what he has to say about it. At that time, I built a city at the foot of Mount Musri, and I named it Dur Sharukin. Not one of the kings before me had discerned its location or thought to make it habitable. I planned day and night. And that he did. Laying the foundation on an auspicious day, he wielded a pickaxe as a ritual start of construction, creating a fortified rectangle of 3 square kilometers of walls over 25 meters high, a palace of 200 rooms on a raised citadel, temples, a ziggurat. He even had a botanical garden, creating a replica of Mount Amanus, gathering all the aromatic plants of Hatti and every kind of fruit tree of the mountains. Cedars and evergreens from the Lebanese and Syrian mountains, fruit trees from the Zagros, even exotic herbs from conquered deserts, all transplanted to grow around a palace in the Iraqi plains. Inaugurating it in 706 BC, foreign rulers and officials brought lavish tribute, and for a few months, Sargon lived in a monument of his own legitimacy. A man with no claim to the throne, having every brick to his name. But I said for a few months. 705 BC, everything shattered. Campaigning in Tabal, South Central Anatolia, either from local revolts or invading Sumerian nomads from the steppe, Sargon was killed in battle. But guess what? His body couldn't be recovered. A body that couldn't be brought back to Assyria for burial meant a restless and furious ghost. The court first immediately performed exorcism rituals, calmed the ghost of the king who died in the foreign lands. But then many read the death as divine punishment, or as theft of the god Haldi from Musasir. Sargon had stolen the gods, and the gods took away his legitimacy. but he left behind the largest territory Assyria possessed. Order secured Ryle defeated with the Babylon crown, but with the son, was deeply spiritually rattled from this. These kings carved real-life horror stories into stone. Welcome back. The king Sargon II has died, unceremoniously. Shahrukhin, the legitimate king, who spent his whole reign trying to make sure that all the processions and rituals went in his favor, who set up a new capital at Dur-Shahrukhin, had his body unrecoverable in battle. But he left behind a massive amount of territory and no rivals, along with the crown of Babylon, just like we said. But remember, like we said as well, he left someone else behind. The next man, King Sennacherib. Now, when he came to the throne in 705 BC, he was spiritually rattled and in the shadow of catastrophe. With the manner of his father's death, and Sennacherib now becoming the new king, he saw his father as an ill omen. When he inherited the empire, he left Dur-Shahrukhin, abandoning it entirely and moving the capital to Nineveh. And he never spoke of his father with the same level of reverence that most Assyrian sons normally showed. Clearly, he was spiritually shook from this entire experience, also having to project spiritual authority along with legitimizing equilibrium that was able to soothe all of what happened to his father. He announced himself the great king, the powerful king, king of the world, king of Assyria, king of the four quarters, watchful shepherd, perfect hero, the great one who consumes the rebellious, who strikes the hostile with lightning. Ashur has granted me a kingdom without rival. Now, his first campaign in 703 BC drove south into Babylonia, where he faced the now Chaldean warlord Merodach-Baladan, the same one whose men his father had made corpses out of, and then heaps of those corpses. Now, he starts out by saying, "In my first campaign, in the vicinity of Kish, I brought about the overthrow of Merodach-Baladan, king of Karduniash, together with the troops of Elam, his allies. He abandoned his camp and saved his life by fleeing alone. I besieged, captured, and carried away the spoils of 75 large walled cities of Kaldu and 420 of the smaller cities around them. I drove off more than 200,000 people, small and great, male and female, along with the horses, mules, cattle, and sheep. A deportation on the scale of emptying a modern city in a season. Listen to this. The men of Hirimu, a stubborn enemy, I brought low with my weapons, and a single one did not escape. Their corpses I hung on posts and placed round the city." Sennacherib's words end up paralleling Ashur-Nisirpal's exactly. That unhinged insanity that came up through sheer religious desire and need from Ashur-Nisirpal started to show up spiritually, yeah, from Sennacherib, but there's a bit of daddy issues involved too, giving us another unique strain of Neo Assyrian king. Now, just like his father Sargon II, he also had some pretty hard campaigns. In his second campaign, he marched east into the Zagros Mountains, the ranges along the modern Iran-Iraq border, against the Kassite Highlanders, who he says, from time immemorial, had not been submissive to my kings, my fathers. Through the high mountain forests, a rough country, I rode on horseback, and I hauled up my chariots with ropes. The steepest places I climbed on foot like a wild ox. The king on foot, on a goat track in the alpine cold, his men dragging siege equipment and dismantled chariots up cliffs surrounded by thin air with rope, in the land of the nomads with snow-fed torrents surrounding them. When the campaign was done, he said, I burned the nomads' tents. I burned with fire and let them go up in flames. I reduced their towns to plowland. But then, I made its walls stronger than ever, and I settled therein the peoples captured by my hand. Once again showing the formula that he can just take someone else's stuff and maintain it and expand it better than they ever could. It's especially funny hearing him talk about Medes. He first says, the mention of whose country no one among the kings my fathers had heard. He was basically just calling all of them irrelevant, saying nobody heard about them, but still got them to pay him tribute. Now his third campaign runs straight through the Hebrew Bible. in 701 BC into the land of the Hittites, which to him was just a term for the Levant, the coast and hills of modern Lebanon, Israel, Palestinian territories, and Jordan. The Phoenician coast fell city by city. Sennacherib said the kings of the region, of Byblos, Arvad, Ashdod, Ammon, Moab, Edom, brought rich presents and kissed my feet. At Ekron I killed the governors and chiefs who had brought about rebellion, and I hung their corpses on poles round about the city. Strangely, he spares the ordinary population, not really being indiscriminate in his third campaign. Then he finally encountered the linchpin of the Western Revolt, Judah and Hezekiah. This is what he says about his experience in the Judean cities. 46 of his strong walled cities, and the smaller cities round about them without number, by the battering of rams and the attacking of war engines, by making breaches, by cutting through walls, and by use of axes I besieged and captured 200,150 people, small and great, male and female, I brought forth from their midst, and reckoned as spoil. Hezekiah himself I shut up like a caged bird. In Jerusalem, his royal city, I threw up fortifications against him, and whoever came out of the gates of his city, I punished. Hezekiah bought his survival, 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, ivory furniture, his daughters, his palace women, male and female singers. But Sennacherib never says that he took Jerusalem, just the caging and the tribute. Now the biblical story says that the angel of the Lord struck the Assyrian camp and saved the city, according to 2 Kings 19:35. According to the contemporary historical records, we see no Assyrian setback. But then we gotta go to the Battle of Haule in 691 BC against a Babylonian Elamite coalition. And it's at this point, Sennacherib's language and whatever he had previously experienced made him unhinged. Maybe it was that spiritual shaking mixed with rough terrain and then larger than life odds that he actually accomplished with the Assyrian model. I don't know. Whatever it is, he's talking about himself as the incarnate of a storm god. I was as fierce as a lion. In the anger of my heart I donned my helmet, the sign of war. Like a storm I raged, like Raman I roared. I carved a path through corpses. With arrow and lance I cut off the hostile soldiers. Umba Nundasha, the chief of the king of Elam, like fat steers hobbled with chains, I cut them down with the axe. I cut their necks like wild animals. Their precious lives I cut in two like a cord. Their swift steeds harnessed to my chariot swam in the mass of their blood, as in a river. Blood and filth poured down the wheels of my war chariot. I filled the field with the corpses of their warriors, like herb, like the seeds of ripe cucumbers. I cut off their hands. With sharp swords I cut off their noses, and those remaining with their own urine soiled their chariots. Do I really have to give any extra commentary to that? The dude became a Neo-Assyrian war crime poet, but this extreme power and show of power that came from the machine that he was in, along with his personal issues, had him go completely off the rails in 689 BC, Babylon. The balancing act that was put onto the empire by Tiglath-Pileser was about to meet the ferocious king with daddy issues. After years of rebellion, Sennacherib ordered the sack of Babylon. Babylon was the most sacred city in Mesopotamia. God Marduk was legendary even to Assyrians. Sennacherib looted and burned it, tore down its walls, took the statue of Marduk himself, and then opened the canals and turned the Euphrates towards it, destroying its temples and flooding the remains until the bricks dissolved into mud. Idiotically and ironically, through his amplification of insanity and ferocity, likely caused from the spiritual rattling he experienced from his father's actions, in Urartu, with their god, Sennacherib ended up losing the plot entirely, and doing that on a completely different cosmic scale, crossing even his own people's standards, and now being really under threat by the cosmic order. at least in the eyes of literally everybody. But before going into where this is inevitably going to go, you have to look at what Sennacherib was going to leave behind. So for next part. These kings carved real-life horror stories into stone. It's good to see you again. Sennacherib has officially gone off the deep end, even for a Neo Assyrian king. Rebellion or not, family or not, the way he decimated Babylon, everybody thought there was some sort of spiritual reckoning coming. But all this energy and feeling was culminating in the Babylonians, yes, but also in Nineveh, which remember was Sennacherib's capital, not Dur-Sharrukin, which was abandoned shortly after Sargon II's death. You see, along with having daddy issues and being a little bit unhinged, Sennacherib was also an engineer. It's very likely that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon actually were in Nineveh, made by Sennacherib. With all the spoils and slave labor from his wars, Nineveh was the greatest city of its age. He found the old palace inadequate. It had no foundation. Its rooms were too small and its construction was not artistic. I tore that palace down completely. He reclaimed swampland from the Kosa River, raised an artificial terrace, and built what he called the palace without rival. It was roofed in cedar hauled from Mount Amanus and guarded by colossal winged bulls, made with white limestone. With white pilu stone from Balatai, I built splendid Lamasu and Shedu, and stationed them on the right and left. And to water the expanded city, he had 18 canals dug and built the Pati Sennacherib Canal from Mount Tas on the Urartian border, more than 90 kilometers long, carrying water over ravines on massive stone aqueduct bridges at Jerwan, 1,000 years before the Romans. This being the potential real sea to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, likely Nineveh, being one of the first true aqueducts in the world. He also sealed a tablet underneath the palace, kind of like a time capsule. For future days, whoever among the kings, my sons, when this palace becomes old and ruined, may he repair its damages. See the inscription bearing my name, anoint it with oil, make an offering, and return it to its place. Whoever alters my writing and my name, may Ashur, the great lord, father of the gods, treat him as an enemy, and take scepter and throne from him, and overthrow his rule. Yeah, but then came the day the Babylonians foretold. On the 20th day of Tebet, 681 BC, 4 years after, Sennacherib was assassinated by his own sons while praying in a temple. According to 2 Kings 1937, Adramlek and Sharezer, his sons, struck him down with the sword. They escaped into the land of Ararat. The king who had written of cutting throats like lamb, along with hanging heads like a bunch of grapes, had his blood spilled on the sanctuary floor and across the throne, undoing everything he tried to undo from his father, and leaving a succession battle and the problem of a drowned city to his younger son who wasn't even near the city to begin with that day. Enter Esarhaddon, reigning from 681 to 669 BC. Probably the most interesting out of all these guys, because when it comes to his writing, we actually have some of his private correspondence, and we can build a little bit more of a psychological profile of Esarhaddon. And with a dad like Sennacherib, the dude was sort of chronically anxious. He was a conqueror who really felt a deep sense of constant dread. First of all, he got completely blindsided. Esarhaddon didn't want any of this. We can't be sure, but deep down, he probably didn't want his father to absolutely decimate Babylon. And we can tell based on his later actions, which we'll get into. But once everything was up in the air, Esarhaddon had to act. Probably after already being in a deeper sense of dread after the destruction of Babylon, and maybe being already prepared getting the news of his father's death because of this, he marched on Nineveh and won a 6-week civil war against his own brothers. And that fratricide mixed with the trauma and the dread make the wording in Esarhaddon's private correspondence psychologically harrowing. Recurring fevers, violent vomiting, vertigo, and a rash that scrawled his entire body. And guess what? He was depressed and admitted it. I am feeling very sad. How have I become so depressed? Written after his wife's death plunged him further into grief. His fortress palaces at Kalhu and Nineveh were sealed and could be locked off from the entire city. He's documented sequestering himself inside for days, consuming neither food nor drink, waking up from random nightmares of betrayal, commissioning his royal diviners to ask the sun god Shamash by name which of his officials and brothers harbored treason. But make no mistake, he won that civil war. That paranoia, depression, and extra emotion still formed within the Neo-Assyrian machine. Esarhaddon may have been thoughtful, but he was still a storm. When the Phoenician port of Sidon, on the coast of modern Lebanon, rebelled, Esarhaddon recorded its king's fate. Abdi Mikuti, who trusted in the fearful sea and cast off my yoke. Like a fish I caught him from the sea and I cut off his head. He then hung the severed necks of two defeated kings around the necks of their own captured nobles like they were wearing chains, and marched them through the streets of Nineveh. But Esarhaddon achieved something that no other Assyrian before him ever achieved. See, in the year 674 in his military campaigns, he had a pretty rough defeat. His army had crossed the Sinai Desert way too fast. They arrived exhausted at the Egyptian border near Ashkelon, and were routed by the Kushite pharaoh Tarharka. He returned with an overwhelming force in 671 BC, fought his way up through the Nile Delta in what the records just refer to as 3 massacres, and took the ancient capital of Memphis in a single day. Memphis, his royal city, in half a day with mines, tunnels, assaults. I besieged, I captured, I devastated, I destroyed, I burned with fire. I captured Taharka's queen, harem, and crown prince and deported them back to Assyria. The root of Kush I tore up out of Egypt. He then commissioned the stele which we found in southern Turkey, where he's raising his hands to the gods in triumph, while 2 men are kneeling below him, with cords passed through rings driven into their lips, dragged forth by Esarhaddon, carved into stone. One of the most concentrated images of subjugation Assyria has ever produced. But Esarhaddon was a superstitious man. No superstitious man would just allow the Babylon problem to fester. The city drowned, the sacred city, by the Assyrians. Not just Assyrians, his father. What he did was flip the cuneiform that was associated with Marduk's omen and decree related to Babylon after its destruction. Instead of 77 years, he flipped it to 11, conveniently making the little pocket of his father's insanity something that had to happen as part of the larger cosmic record. But now with him being ordained by the Babylonian gods to restore everything back to its rightful place, fully rewriting his family's war crime while being triumphant at the same time, building the Isaglia temple and the ziggurats, becoming a builder in Babylon. As Esarhaddon was going through the years of his reign, he did not forget what he felt to even become king in the first place, and he would not allow that feeling to plague his sons. He had nearly lost everything to a succession war. So in 672 BC, he summoned the entire empire, nobles, generals, governors, and foreign vassal kings from Medes to the Levant, and made every single one of them swear elaborate, divinely cursed loyalty oaths to his 2 chosen heirs, Ashur-banipal, the king of Assyria, and the elder Shamash-shum-ukin as king of Babylon. Also, around 670 BC, there was some conspiracy that happened in the Neo-Assyrian Empire that caused Esarhaddon to purge a lot of his officers, putting them to the sword. Then in 669, Egypt rebelled. Esarhaddon felt like he had to step up, but on the road to Haran, the thoughts, sickness, and feeling all caught up with him, and the thoughtful storm Esarhaddon died there. Now you may think that the next man will be Shamash-shum-ukin, the eldest son, but it wasn't. It was his brother, Ashur-banipal, the creator of the library of Ashur-banipal, the annihilator of Susa. The stone reliefs of his era showing the apex of the past 252 years, fully barreling towards it all, showing it all in the most full view possible, with major depictions of lion hunts, major depictions of impalements, intense sieges, beheadings, flayings, and within 50 years of Ashur-banipal, it got so crazy, but he needs his own section, and he will end this long story. This will be the wildest king you've ever heard about. Let me explain. Look, meet me in the 7th century BC, in the Near East or West Asia, around the Neo-Assyrian Empire. I don't want to go inside. Why not? Well, even the biblical prophets didn't want to go over here, even when God himself forced them to. The kings of Neo Assyria were absolute nutcases of the ancient world. See, the ancient Assyrians transitioned into Neo Assyrians by becoming insanely warlike, more than the ancient world already was. Tiglath-Pileser III literally invented mass deportations, specifically as a governance tool. Later on, King Sennacherib decimated the Vatican of his time, Babylon, and this whole thing was held together by one thing and one thing only: divine fear. Roadsides of the Assyrian Empire were lined with forests of impaled bodies, but they got creative and did it so often, it's inscribed into stone. In fact, all of the points and details of imagery that I'm going to use to describe these moments and scenes are actually not from my words, but the direct personal words of these exact kings, because they believed that documenting military atrocity was actually fulfilling a divine order. City walls of conquered towns were draped with flayed skins of rebel leaders. Flaying was something the Assyrians specialized in. Prisoners were chained by their lips to gateposts. But all of this was government policy, as in like real manuals, training sessions, drills over the most sadistic and brutal ways to torture your enemy. Celebrating and preserving terror as a strategic doctrine, all in the glory of God. Now in this world, in the royal court of Nineveh, entered Ashur-banipal, born around the year 685 BC, as the youngest son of King Esarhaddon, conqueror of Egypt. Now Ashur-banipal was not the first choice. While his elder brothers were being prepared for war command and provincial governance, Ashur-banipal was educated in scribal arts. In fact, he was kind of a nerd. He fully learned cuneiform, mastered both Sumerian and Akkadian, even in their archaic forms, and actually has inscriptions bragging about understanding texts before the flood, literally bragging about the kind of books he could read. But with a vast imperial and really rare subset of knowledge, from omen text, astronomical records, to even medical prescriptions, and saying that the knowledge was bestowed upon him by the gods themselves, being able to read the entrails of sacrificed animals and the stars. The dude was positioned to be a scholar. But in 669, Esarhaddon died. But thankfully, before he died, set up his succession properly. See, at the time, Babylon and Assyria were sister civilizations, except the Babylonians looked at the Assyrians as warlike, and the Assyrians the Babylonians as either soft or too pretentious. The relationship would go up and down, but after Sennacherib destroyed Babylon, it was in the gutter. Esarhaddon made a lot of moves to make sure that the relationship came back to normal, but it was really fragile. Think like these guys sort of had similar genealogy, but chose different cultural paths. Kinda like India-Pakistan, sort of. But anyways, before Esarhaddon died, he made his eldest son Shamash-shum-ukin the king of Babylon. And somehow, due to court nobles and his grandmother, Ashur-banipal became the king of Assyria. But there was a structural problem to it. The crown of Babylonia was still subordinate to the crown of Assyria. Babylonian kingship required Assyrian confirmation. The king of Babylon was the elder brother of the king of Assyria. Babylon also holds religious and cultural pride and a chip on their shoulder after what happened. You see where I'm going with this? But look, before we get into all of that, Ashur-banipal is now king. The scholar meant to be behind the clay tablet is now sitting on the throne, and he needed to make sure the people knew. In 667, barely a year on the throne, Ashur-banipal marched his armies toward the Nile. The Nubian pharaoh Taraka had revolted, and Ashur-banipal was going to make his name known. Thebes, the city where the temples of Amun stood for generations, was sacked with a thoroughness that shocked the ancient world. And Ashur-banipal himself boasts of what was taken: silver, gold, precious stone, garments, horses, people, male, female, and 2 tall obelisks that stood for centuries, whose weight was 2,500 talents. Chests of gold, lapis lazuli, exotic animals, royal furniture, all hurled back to Assyria by Ashur-banipal. When they found the prince who revolted, he was seized and beheaded on the spot. His severed head, with warm blood still dripping from the neck, was carried through the ravaged city and nailed at the city gate, where it blackened under the Egyptian sun. The roar of the Nile was loud, but the roar of Ashur was louder. Entire populations were shackled across the Nile. Women, children, and the elderly were marched on foot, feet shredded on burning sand, lips cracking from thirst, children crying with hunger until the voices were naturally silenced. Families separated with people being too sick to march. The deportees who survived going to a place where their language was not spoken, and their identities slowly disappearing. With Ashur-banipal hearing all of this, still moving forward. Ashur-banipal then sieged Tyre, making the city smell of death, with the elderly and children being unburied. Then the Battle of Ulai, 653 BC. Ashur-banipal was fighting King Theoman of Elam. Elam was a nation that was threatening the Assyrian vassals, and funding any resistance to Assyria, their most significant eastern rival. So Ashurbanipal went above and beyond. Ashurbanipal says that he broke the ranks at the Ulai River and made the river flow red with blood and dyed its waters red like wool, saying the Elamites felt like Baltu plants, comparing wanton slaughter to wheat agriculture. The Elamite king Teuman was killed on the battlefield, along with his son. An Assyrian soldier beheaded him, where it was sent back to Nineveh, where it remained for months. But how do we know that? Oh my god. Ashurbanipal commissioned a wall relief where he's having a garden party with the head of Teuman hanging on a tree. Think of how long this took, and then understand how casual that really was, and what that indicates. Then came the Babylonian revolt of 652 BC. Shamash-shum-ukin had enough, bringing together a grand coalition of tribes and formally revolting against Assyria. Ashurbanipal in his records calls him an unfaithful brother and a traitor for this. But since he viewed himself as a representation of the divine, he saw his brother as violating his own role as his brother by going against the divine itself. Ashurbanipal then sieged Babylon for 3 years, and his inscriptions reveling at the famine he caused, pridefully recording that they ate the flesh of their sons, and drinking the blood of their daughters. By 648, the great city of Babylon had become a city of desperation and cannibalism. When Ashurbanipal's forces finally breached the walls, Shamash-shum-ukin locked himself in the palace and set it on fire, burning himself to death with only his crown surviving, which Ashurbanipal claimed as spoils of war, destroying his brother's images and unleashing hell on the Babylonian rebels, saying he cut the throats of the rebel leaders like sheep, saying so many were killed the Euphrates ran red, gathering the specific surviving elite, putting them through a gauntlet of cruelty, tongues torn out, men flayed in front of their families while still alive, men forced to crush the bones of their ancestors, to erase all their ties to the physical world. With Ashurbanipal describing skin being flayed like bark on a tree, slowly and methodically, describing a victim screaming, bleeding, and continuing to breathe, with corpses being fed to eagles, pigs, dogs, and wolves. He hacked the royal eunuch who served his older brother to pieces, and impaled the rest of the leaders on stakes around the city gates. What's especially insane is we have the recorded instances of these ancient people's fates. Ancient peoples meaning kings, rulers of entire lands, representations of entire ethnicities. Chief Dunanu was paraded through the streets of Arbela with severed heads hanging around his neck, had his tongue cut out with red-hot pincers while he was still conscious, then flayed him alive, then burned him alive, then ordered the charred remains amputated and sent to the various provinces. When the Arab king was captured, Ashurbanipal didn't execute him. He pierced a hole in his jaw. The representation of the Arabs ran a rope through it and put a dog collar around his neck, chaining him to the east gate of Nineveh. Passerbys were encouraged to spit on him, and he ate scraps, with his behavior later becoming animalistic. The representation of the Arabs turned into a dog. But the ultimate show of Ashurbanipal's dominance in the ancient world was the annihilation of Elam. I said annihilation, not conquest, annihilation. Guys, this was likely the first case of ethnic genocide. Elam's capital Susa was systematically destroyed, literally. Temples were leveled, and the royal tombs were opened. Ashurbanipal ordered the royal bones to be scattered in the wind, to never let Elam's ghosts rest. He then ordered the fields of the city salted, like literally salted. By 646 BC, Elam as a civilization was gone. And on the day of his triumph, 4 kings were forced to push his procession. But the same guy who ordered his soldiers to rip open pregnant women was still a scholar nerd. Through his absolutely insane campaigns, he collected as many clay tablets as he could, storing them in the first library in history, with depictions of him killing lions on his palace walls, projecting fear and power literally everywhere. Now, Ashurbanipal died around 631 BC. He reigned for 38 years, outlived all his enemies, and did everything he wanted. But all the resentment that he built up came to a head in 612 BC, when Nineveh was completely sacked, a combined hatred of many peoples. Then burned down his library, but because it was clay, it got saved, giving us epics from this nutty wizard